I didn't know it did that. Okay. So we are going to be making this project today. And it is really a very fun one featuring the Flowers of Friendship bundle and 4 of the 5 new in colors. I only left out the, you know what? I'm lying to you. I put every single one of the 5 new in colors in here. So this does include all of them. I was thinking I had left one out. And I am going to start. I'm not even going to describe what I did. I think it's just much easier and much more fun to start. And the way I'm going to start is I've grabbed a piece of white, basic white cardstock. This is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. And that means that it's going to be less in width and less in height than the finished card. We're going to end up putting a frame behind it as well. But again, this is 4 by 5 1/4. And then I am going to get a few of the images from the stamp set. I'm getting both of the flowers, and I am going to grab both of the leaves. And I'm going to get a couple of the colors, some of the in colors. The polished pink, the fresh freesia, and the soft succulent. And I'm going to use the polished pink for the small flower, the fresh freesia for the large flower, and then for both the leaves, I'll use the soft succulent. And as I start doing some of my stamping, I just want to make sure that I leave an area that will end up being for my sentiment. And I purposely made this into a circle, and I've got some circle dies that I'll use later. But I want to kind of block this off visually, this space, which will mean that I will not be stamping on it. I just want to give myself a little bit of a visual cue as far as where not to stamp. And what I did for this is I used a Post-it note and the largest circle die that I'm going to use for this project. And I'm really just going to put this down. And I'm not going to be super scientific. If I put it about like that, I do want to make sure that I'm not going to cut off way too much of the circle on the right because I want to have my sentiment kind of hanging over. So I'm just going to put that down. Then I'm going to grab my small flower. And this is a little foreign for me because I usually use the Stamparatus. And I'm going to stamp a couple of flowers. And I'm doing this pretty randomly. So I'm going to get that pretty juicy. Just make sure that the ink is going all over. And just put in a couple of images. And I've had some fun doing a little bit more of the free form in terms of stamping and not getting so precise with my Stamparatus. So I've got 3 of those. I'm going to change over. I don't want to overwhelm anything just yet. And I'm going to check and see how my flowers look as I build this scene. And then if I need to go back and fill something in, I will. Now I've got the fresh freesia and the larger flower stamp. And I'm going to fill in the blanks just a little bit here. And I'm trying not to get the flowers all going in the same direction. So kind of paying attention to what direction the petals are leaning toward and making it a little bit different. And let's see, I'll put one more right there. And again, I don't want to overcrowd this because I am going to be adding leaves. We're going to be adding some other interest to the back. So I'm going to leave this for now and see how it all turns out when I add in the leaves. I'm going to grab my soft succulent. And as I mentioned, I'm going to use both of the leaf stamps. And I'm going to put in different size leaves depending upon what size flower I'm working with. So the larger flowers, I'll use the larger leaves. And then on the smaller ones, I'm going to use the smaller leaf. And just like I did before, I'm going to try to get the leaves to be on different angles, heading different directions. And I'm trying not to get the leaf super, super close. I can go back and fill that in with a marker if I want to later. I'm not going to worry about that. And I'm just going to keep on going and add in, let's see, I'm going to put that one, I'll put that down here. All right, so I've got my leaves, and again, I can fix that later as far as where that missed. I'm going to come in with my smaller leaf, and I'm going to just put a couple of images in here. And we're just going to be happy and very good. All right. And again, I don't want to crowd this out at this point. So this is my starting point. This is where I'm going to leave it for just 1 minute. And as I have completed that step, I'm now going to prep some paper. Bring this back in. I'm going to prep the paper to do the second layer of the flowers. And this is where we're going to talk a little bit about some tricks and tips on using the punch and being as smart as you can as far as how you orient the stamp when you actually stamp the image and how you can conserve on some paper as well. So the two that we are going to be creating for the second layer of stamps include the smaller flower and the bigger flower. And you may notice that I'm going to be stamping the smaller flower in the same color that I did on the background and the larger in the same color that I did on the background. So I'm going to pull in the polished pink, and the first thing I'm going to do is stamp the images that I'm going to use for that second layer for the smaller flower. And let's talk about this for a second. Let's bring the punch in. When you start to think about the best way to stamp images that correlate to a punch, and also where to stamp them on your paper, turn your punch upside down and look at it like this. And look at how the images are showing. Meaning, if I look at the small flower, that small flower is an X. If I look at the larger flower, that flower is in the shape of, I'll call that a cross. I'm not punching out the leaves right now, so I'm really not focused on those. That means that when I stamp my smaller flower images, I'm going to stamp them so they look like an X on the paper. I'm also going to stamp them at the bottom of my paper because that image, that hole with a small flower is at the bottom of the punch. And I don't need to have a lot of paper at the top that's going to be wasted. So I don't need a really wide piece of paper. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this piece of paper and get this larger flower out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp those images. But I'm going to get a couple of things prepped before I do that stamping. And it's not incredibly easy to see on camera, but the second layer of flour is embossed, and it's embossed with clear powder. You could emboss with gold powder or any other metallic as well. I'm using clear powder. And what you need to do is when you're using clear powder on top of regular ink, you need to be kind of quick. The regular ink is going to dry fairly quickly, which means that you just need to have everything ready to go. And we're going to prep this like we normally would for any kind of embossing. So I've got my embossing buddy, which is older than dirt and still has a lot of the anti-static in. So I'm doing that, and I'm doing this all over this piece because I will be stamping one flower, one flower, one flower. I'm going to space them apart, and I'll tell you why I'm going to do that as well. So I've got that all set. I also have my clear embossing powder ready, and I have my little tray that I will capture the embossing powder in, all set to go. And as we've done before, as everybody does when you get ready to emboss, just make sure that that top is off, and you will be all set to pour on your embossing powder. So again, I am just triple checking the orientation of the hole in my punch because I want to stamp my image in that same orientation on my paper. I'm also going to come down to about the bottom because, again, I don't need a lot of paper at the bottom. I don't need to be able to move it really far. All right, so I have those stamped. Now I'm going to bring in my powder. I'm being very liberal with the amount of powder that I'm putting on here. I'll recapture it when we do the purple flowers. And I'm just going to knock off some of that powder. And if you were here, you would be able to see that there definitely is powder on each of those flowers. What's kind of fun is when you put embossing powder onto an ink that you are familiar with, you're going to see that when you heat set it, the color of the ink is a little bit dull. It doesn't look quite as bright as the normal color that you see. I'm going to close this up because I don't want to dry out my ink. I've also put the lid on the powder because I don't want that going everywhere. And I've got my heat gun going. I'm just going to set this really quick. And then I'm going to punch this out. And I'm going to show, actually, I'm going to wait and punch it out first. But we'll get the other piece prepped as well with the big flowers. So I'm just going to go ahead and get this melted. I apologize. This is a little noisy and not the most exciting thing to listen to while you're watching somebody stamp. Make sure that it's nice and melted. All right. And I'm just going to peer under the light and make sure everything looks good and melted. And yeah, that's pretty good. All right, so I'm not going to punch these out yet, but I want to show you also why I spaced these out as much as I did. You notice on the punch, you have a leaf that is really close to the small flower punch. You have another hole. So if you don't spread these apart a little bit, you could run into punching out. I'm not going to punch this out yet because I'm not done with it. But if I had put my second flower closer, I might cut off a little bit of the flower. I just needed to make sure that it was far enough away that when I punch that out, it's going to miss. And I'm also going to trim off the top of that paper when we get to that point. But I'm going to set this one aside. And now I am going to stamp the larger flowers. and get those embossed. And then we're going to get into the fun of the coloring, which is the magic in this whole thing. So again, to be repetitive, this flower is at the top and it's in the shape of a cross, which means that when I stamp this, I'm going to get everything ready to pour on my embossing powder. I am going to stamp these images, and then I'm going to put embossing powder on the top, and I am going to heat set these as well. And I am being super liberal, just like I was a minute ago, and pouring my powder on. And I will put this off. I did the embossing buddy off camera, so hopefully that will work okay. And put my powder way over to the side, so I do not inadvertently blow it all over my work surface. That would not be happy. Close this up, and we're going to do this really quick. The heat gun should be nice and hot since I just did the other ones. And we're just going to melt this really fast, and then we're going to get into the coloring. And what's nice about using the clear embossing is you don't have to have a certain color embossing powder. You can use it on any ink, and it will give you the outline of that ink color. All right, so we're good on both of those. Okay, so now let's do a little bit of coloring. And this is going to be done by bringing in a block. And I'm also going to bring in, I have an old aqua painter. I know there are some new aqua painters that are in the catalog. And I still have my old one, so I'm going to use my old one. If you don't have one of these aqua painters, just grab a brush, a small brush, and a little bit of water, and you can clean out your brush as you're going. And what we're going to do is we're just going to add a little bit of color, the same color that we used for the background stamping, and we're going to add that to the petals. And because we have embossed the outline, we've got a little bit of a barrier that should prevent that ink from going farther than where we want it to go. And what I like to do with this is I'm going to grab my ink pad and my little block, and I'm just going to put some ink directly onto the block. And that way I have a palette. I'm going to go to the block rather than go into the ink pad. And for me, it's just easier. You can also take your ink pad and push it down, and it will collect ink on the bottom. And then you can open up the pad and use that as a palette as well. And my brush is not very wet. I can feel it damp on my hand. And I'm just going to work this a little bit. I don't want it to be super saturated. And I'm just going to bring some color. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start toward the center and just pull it out. But you can do whatever makes you happy. And I do this once on each petal and I leave it. And it kind of takes control itself. It moves around, the color does what it wants to, and it has a really cool watercolor effect. So it's actually pretty quick. And you just do one petal at a time, let the water and the color work together, and you're not necessarily going to get the same saturation on each of the petals, which is also fun, because that way things look a little different. So I'm just going to put that in. And you can see where we did the heat setting over the part that we already stamped. That looks darker, and it is not being disturbed by the water that I'm putting on here. It is just staying put. You'll also notice as the ink dries that the hue changes. It gets a little bit lighter, and it also tends to spread out a little, which is fun. So I'm just adding in some color, and I'm really not overthinking this, just kind of putting it in. Now think about this. This would look really, really pretty if you had gold embossing and you came back in with some water in your ink and add whatever color ink you want. And you can also use any other metallic color. You could also choose to use a different ink color than the ink that you use to stamp the image. And it would have a really nice contrast. You can also, if you get really creative and want to do this, you can put one layer of color down, let's say maybe a yellow. Let that dry, or if you're impatient, take the heat gun and force it to dry. And then you can come back with another layer of color, and you'll have a really pretty dual color combination going on that is just super, super fun and also very unique, because every time you do this, it's going to look a little different. I'm leaving the centers of these flowers as is because I'm going to come back and I'm going to add a little bit of color using, I'm going to use the marker, the pale papaya marker, just to add a little color so you can get that color on the card as well. But I'm going to put that to the side just for a minute. And then I'm going to grab a paper towel. You can also just scrub off the watercolor pencil or your brush, just clean off the color with an aqua cleaner. You just kind of move it around. I'm going to leave the color on this block because I'm going to use that in a minute to make some of the splotches, the little splatter marks that are on the finished card. So I've done my pink. Now I need to color in the larger flower. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use the fresh freesia. I know I don't say that right. So somebody later will have to remind me what the correct pronunciation is. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. So not to be completely repetitive and boring. I'm just going to grab some of that ink. Sure, it's in a fairly good consistency. I don't want it too watery. And then I'm just going to bring that right back over. And just like I did before, one petal at a time. And get that color in. And I don't know why, but this color to me is just stunning and fun. And it's so light, but it has such a nice saturation. It's just a super, super fun color to work with. And it's really fun to see two different tones of the same color. From the one that we did the heat embossing, and then this one where we're doing watercolor. And this is not a watercolor paper. This is just on regular paper. So you can watercolor on regular old paper. And sometimes you just need to play around with this to get the feel. I also like it when you get petals like the one I just did, where one side is a little darker, the other not quite as dark, just a little bit darker. So I'm just adding a little more. And this is kind of fun too. It's a little more pale. And like I said, you're going to get a unique hue on many of these that are going to look just a tad different. So bringing that in. Okay. This is really pretty quick. You could go back to your original card if you want, and you could do some watercoloring on the card as well. You're going to see in a minute when I bring the original card back in. I chose not to do that. I wanted to have a little bit of white underneath the second layer of flower, but it's totally up to you. Whatever makes you happy. And I don't think this is really easy to see on camera, but I can see the sparkle in the embossing. that I did. And it's adding just a little bit of fun to the image as well. So we're almost done with our flower images here. And again, don't overthink. Just let it kind of do its magic on its own. Water and ink will do that. All right, so we've got our flowers. I'm putting that black to the side, but I'm going to use it in just a minute. And then what I'm going to do is I'm taking my Stampin' Write marker, the brush side, and I'm just going to go in and fill in that circle. And I'm not being super persnickety in the way I'm doing this because having a little bit of imperfection in the middle of the flower is also going to make it a little more interesting. So just coming in and popping in a little bit of this really, really pretty pale papaya, which is absolutely stunning. Okay, so let's kind of take a peek as far as where we are and then where we need to go. And we're gonna do the next step. So here's where we are. We stamped our base. We've done the second layer of the flowers. So we've stamped the base, we've done the second layer of the flowers. What do we need to continue to do? Well, we need to punch out the flowers. We need to add some splatter to the base. And then we're also going to do a little bit of blending on that. And then the sentiment, I'll show you a quick way to do that. So let's get to the splattering. This is where you're going to feel like your inner child is just having the best time. And then we're going to come back and we're going to finish these out. So splattering. I'm getting the original card out of the way. I don't want to re-splatter that. And I'm going to put my card that I'm going to splatter. It's just going to say splatter. I'm going to put that right in the middle of my scrap piece of paper. And I'm just going to have a paper towel, or you don't even really need a paper towel to be honest. I'm just going to have that close by. So what we're going to do is we're going to load up this aqua painter with some color. And then I'm going to hold the aqua painter like this and I'm going to hit it. And it will splatter the color on my paper. And I'm going to purposely leave this circle here because I want the splatter to go around that circle. I want there to be some white around my sentiment. And this is where you're going to play. And you're going to, kind of feel this out. If you've got a brush and you're doing this, you're doing the exact same thing. You're just going to load up your brush. And if you want to practice before you get your card going, just stick. You'll see I've got splatters going right on the top. And I'm just hitting this. So I'm going to put this back on where I just did those splatters. I'm going to load this up again. And you can see it's kind of wet. And I'm just splattering. And you are going to get some water that will splatter as well, just because. And do it as much or as little as you want. And I'm going to make sure that I get some splatters right around that circle. I just want to define that circle a little bit more. And I'm good. If I want to do more, I'll come back and do more. And I'm just cleaning that brush off. And that was the pink that I started with. And what's also kind of fun, and I think I like it, is where you splatter some things because you've got water. The water may react with the ink that's already on the background. I think that looks cool. And part of this we're going to cover up when we put that second layer of flower on anyway. Okay, so now I'm going in and I'm going to load up the brush with the purple. And I'm going to practice with this one just because I like to splatter. So got that going. Okay, that's working. I'm going to bring my brush back in, load it up again. And that is important. Now for me, the purple needs to be just a tad darker. So I'm just going to add a little more. There we go. Oh, I got a little too long. All right. So I've done my splattering. And then what I'm going to do is I want to heat set this just a tad, because the next thing that I'm going to do is use a blender brush, and I'm just going to blend a little bit around where I have my circle. And I want to make sure that this is dry. Now you can even air dry it a little bit like this, and it shouldn't take too long because it's ink. It's just like the regular ink that we have been using that will dry. It's not like an embossing powder. And I'm actually checking, that looks dry enough, so I don't think I will do the heat gun. If you want to make sure that everything really is dry, you can grab your heat gun and just heat set it really quick. And that way you will be absolutely sure that everything is all set. You can also take your piece of paper, and if you have a paper towel nearby, you can just put it so that it is right side down and give it just a little bit of a push. And that will also help get any excess water. So I told you that I had purchased some of these Stampin' Up! Blending brushes. And we all know that I had used some other in the past. And I really like the Stampin' Up! Ones. They are very dense. I don't know if you can see the difference on camera, but I believe there are many, many more bristles on the Stampin' Up! Versus the ones that I have been using. They clean up very well with soap and water, and they do a really nice job. So I'm very pleased with them. I've enjoyed using them. I grabbed some of the purple, and I am going to make sure that I leave my circle on here to block out the edges. And I'm just going around the edge, and I'm just adding a little bit of ink because I do want to mask off an area for my sentiment. So I'm going to grab a little bit more. This is a great way to clean up your block as well when you have used your ink. And I'm just adding it a little bit around there. And I'm not worried about how much I'm blending in, because that isn't the point. It's just making sure that there's going to be an area that looks white where I'm going to have my sentiment. Okay. And this block I can now put aside. And when I'm completely done, if I'm not going to make another card, I would just take that block to the sink and run it under water, and it will clean without a problem. Same thing with this brush. I'm just going to run that under water, and it will clean without a problem as well. All right, so we are now at the point where we can put our pieces together, and we can also take our mask away. So my mask is off, and we're going to put the sentiment there eventually. Before I put the second layer of flowers on, I'm going to build up the card. I find it easier to have the layers put together and then put the flowers on the top when I'm done. And we're going to go ahead and do that. So the base of the card is a regular A2 card base. It is cut at 5.5 and 8.5, and then scored at 4.25. So you get a nice A2 card. And I used basic white. Then what I did is I cut out a piece of the new Evening Evergreen, and I'm going to show you whole. I should get a die cut, but This is 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. So it's right in between the size of the piece that's going on the top and the size of the card. It's just a little bit narrower and shorter. And I like to make sure that I use my paper wisely. So I knew that I was going to cut a frame to go behind my sentiment. And I used a couple of the scalloped, a scallop circle and a regular circle. So I used a scallop circle. These are in the layering circle dies. Cut out this scallop circle and cut it out from the middle of this piece, because no one is ever going to know that there is a hole in the middle of that green piece of paper, because you're never going to see the middle. And I don't have to use another piece of paper to do that. And I then have the frame that I will put on the first layer of my card. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm just going to glue this on. And that's a great trick. And I know we've done it in the past. It's just really a great way to save paper and also to get a secondary piece. I'm just using some Tombow. I'm going to center this as best as I can. Put that down on the front. And then I'm going to go ahead and put my second layer on. And then I will finish with the flowers and my sentiment. And I'm lying to you as I'm looking at this. I'm going to put my sentiment on here first. So stop here. Let me tell you why. If you notice, the sentiment is cut so that it is flush with the side of the white card. And I did that intentionally. I wanted to make it look like it was sort of hanging over the edge. It is much easier to make sure that that sentiment is where you want it to be now than trying to get it to stick where you want it to go later. So let's talk about how to do that. The sentiment is 2 layers. It is the evening evergreen that I just cut out. And then for me, I used another one of the stamps that is in the Flowers for Friendship stamp set. And it's this one right here. And I stamped that with the pale papaya ink. Now, obviously, we're not going to end up with a sentiment that looks like that. We're going to end up cutting it. But I want to make sure I know where to cut it so it looks nice and even. That means that I'm going to put my sentiment together. And I'm just going to glue this, nothing super fancy. And then I'm going to dry mount or kind of position where I want that sentiment to be. And I will use some Post-it notes to put that where I want it. And then I'm going to cut the edge. So this obviously was cut with a circle die. I made sure that the size was smaller than the scallop. This is also in the layering circles collection. And the circle that I used for my mask was one of the layering circle dies as well. So I guess you could look at it as kind of 3 concentric shapes that we use for that. So now what I want to do is I want to kind of position this so that I know where I want this to be and I know what I want to trim off. But I am going to end up putting this on with dimensionals. If you're not going to put this on with dimensionals, you don't need to do what I'm going to do. You could very simply glue this down and then turn everything over and chop off the side of this scallop. Well, I want it to have dimensional, so I need to do one other little thing to make sure that it is going to be positioned where I want it to be. And that means I need to tap it down before I cut it. So I've got some Post-it here, and I'm just going to try and get this straight-ish. And it can try to be perfect. Then tap that down, top and bottom. And then I can flip this over. Just pull those back a little bit. And I know where I need to cut that off. And I'll go ahead and grab my scissors. And I'm just going to cut that right off. And I've got the straight edge that I need to do that. So I can take my Post-it note off. And I have the sentiment that I will bump up with some dimensionals, and it will be nice and flush right against the side. But again, if you want to put your sentiment straight on your card, you don't need to do the Post-it note piece. All right, so we are almost there. I'm now going to add the focal point to the front of the card. And I'll put a little in the middle. Make sure you know that you're opening in the correct way. I've done that too many times. I hope you haven't. And I'm going to go ahead and put that right in the middle. And then I'm going to turn that over and give it a little bit of a burnish with my hand. Then I will put my sentiment on the front. I'm going to add a couple of dimensionals to this to pop it up. And because I use the edge of the focal point as my area that where I knew exactly where I needed to cut, this should line up without any problem. And I like to look at this from above, so I'm just going to stand up. And where I have those little ink splatters, they're going to magically disappear. And I'm just going to make sure I get this right on the edge. And now I can add the flowers. So the only thing we have left to do, I look at this card and I look at this card. We need to add the flowers, and then we need to add a little bloom. So we are back to our punch. Let's talk about this just a little bit more. And we're going to talk about these images. So this image is the one that we're going to punch out on the bottom. Notice if I put this paper in, I'm wasting a lot on the top because I'm going to cut out half of a large flower in both leaves. I don't really need to do that. So I can cut this paper down, and that way I'm not going to waste as much. If you have a punch like this one that has multiple punch shapes, you are inevitably going to waste a little paper. Just accept that. The only way that you're not, and I'll post a video on this, is if you get all the images together, and you, in this case, there would be 4 images that you would want to stamp at the same time, and then you can align them, and you can punch them out, and you get everything punched together. And that way you're really not wasting paper. But you're going to get paper poo. You're just going to get paper poo, and you just need to accept it and kind of move on, because otherwise it will make you a little bit crazy. But I really like punches. They are so portable and quick and very versatile. Now for this one, this top image, I could go back and I could trim off a little bit of the bottom of the paper, and I probably should, but I'm going to be lazy, and I'm not, and I'm just going to punch these out. And you can see too that I made sure that this flower on the left is not interfering with any of the other images. So when I punch out that first purple one, the second one is going to be just fine. And we'll punch out without a problem. We've got our second one. And turn this around. And I will get the third one. And then I'm going to clean up all the paper poo. And yes, you will find paper poo all over your craft area for a while. And again, it's okay. I'm just going to brush that over to the side so you don't have to look at it. And now we have our flowers. I'm going to bring the card back in, and I'm just going to very gently bend the petals a little bit toward me. I am not going to use a bone folder for this. And the reason is, if I use a bone folder, the way that I use bone folders, I would inevitably take a little bit of the embossing powder off, and I don't want to do that. So I'm just very, very carefully folding these up just a little bit, just to give them a little shape. And then what I'm going to do is glue them onto the front using Tombow. I'm going to show you the finished part because I purposely offset them from the flower underneath, so it looks like it is layered, but I didn't want to put it catty corner, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So you're going to notice that, for example, on this flower here, the purple one, I didn't put the flower like this. You definitely could, and it would look really pretty. I decided that I wanted to just do it a little bit off the petal underneath. Don't ask me why. I truly don't know, but that's what hit me when I was doing it. And all I'm going to do is put a little bit of Tombow in the middle of that flower, and then I'm going to decide which way I want the petal to show underneath, meaning, do I want it to show toward the right of the petal? And this one, I will have it show toward the left, and you'll see the difference. And you can kind of play around with that if that's what you want to do. And this one, I have it offset. So the difference here, the one on the right has the flower underneath showing on the right side, and the one on the left is on the left side. And you can just do whatever you want, out whatever makes you happy. And this one, and again, I will come back with a little stamp and write marker where I didn't get that leaf completely stamped and fill in the blank. Or maybe I'll put a little bit of bling over that, and then we'll do everything. That might be what I will do. We'll see. What's also kind of nice is when you put these secondary flowers on the top, where the leaves were sort of hanging on their own, like here, when you put that second flower, the second flower covers up the distance between the leaf and that first flower, so they look like they're more connected. And then we'll do one on the bottom. I'm not overthinking this. I'm not even paying attention as far as which direction things are going, and just sort of letting it all happen. And then the last thing that I'm going to do, and it may or may not be completely obvious on the part on the left, is I'm going to add a little bit of bling. And I really like these opal round. They have a little kind of a gold glitter in the middle, and they're not perfect. And to me, it almost looks like a kind of like a dewdrop. So I'm just going to add a few, not be overthinking where this is going to be. So, and they also, there's little opal rounds come in 2 different sizes. So they're fun to kind of think about where you might want them to go and have different sizes so people will either notice them or not notice them. Oh, I can do that. Then I don't have as much to fix. And I like to do odd numbers. So we've got 3 there. So that is the card. And obviously similar but different when you look at the 2 cards that we made. And if you think about the alternatives to this, they're endless. You could do different embossing powder colors, metallics. You could do different metallics. You could do white on a darker cardstock and not have to put the watercoloring in the middle of the flowers. You could, rather than color in the flowers, you could put the opal rounds or some other fun gemstones in the center as well. You can also choose not to put the sentiment on with dimensional. You can put that in flat. And you can do your splatting with a whole bunch of different colors. And obviously the splattering on this one got a little more watery in here than the one I did originally. But they're both fun and they're both different. So I hope you like this kind of technique and I hope you give it a try. It is a lot of fun. It's very addictive. And it's just one more way to use this really incredible bundle. The possibilities for this are pretty endless. And it's just a really nice portable duo to work with. So I think that's it. So hope you enjoyed.